Okay.
It works.
Our speaker this evening is Matthew Kouba. Matthew Kouba. He describes himself as a partisan, neutral, and pro-people. He has lobbied in Albany with UniteNY in favor of citizen. Oh man, my tongue's tied tonight. In favor of citizen initiatives, lowered ballot access thresholds, term limits, and better voting. He's the founder of Make Voting Powerful and a member and ally of Unite New York, Star Voting New York, and RepresentUS. He has put a lot of effort into understanding New York State home rule powers and how they can be wielded to advance local and statewide reform. Matthew is a college degree holding fast food worker who knows things need to change. I'll now turn the floor over to Matthew, and thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity. So yeah, that was a good introduction of me. And what would be the background? Yeah, so I got involved in all of this over believing that voting reform itself was the key to solving all sorts of problems in our politics, because fundamentally the question of how we select for and elect representation is the first decision made in the entire democratic process. And so the first thing I'll get to is that New York has extensive home rule powers with a interesting and mixed history of when they've been implemented and the times they've been used. But sorry, I didn't have much time to prepare for this presentation. I've given presentations before. The Article IX of the New York State Constitution is the local governments section, and it prescribes a number of broad home rule powers. One of the most important is that it gives all local governments in New York State the power to decide the mode and method of selection and removal of officers, which has been very rarely used in New York State's history, but the broad takeaway from it is that it allows every local government in New York State to set their own voting rules and procedures, even when that directly conflicts with existing New York State law. There's a very complicated process by which it's determined what when a law can supersede, as it's called in home rule. But what's I'm losing focus a bit here. I'm sorry. I only had 45 minutes of sleep as well. So one of the most important takeaways from this, or most important parts of the story, is that the first time this home rule power was used, I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but was when in, I believe the date is 1936, New York City adopted the single transferable vote, or proportional ranked choice voting. They did this under this exact home rule authority, and that sadly did not last very long. This power would be unused in New York State until in 2017, the village of Port Chester would, by local law, use this power to transition their local elections legally over to cumulative voting. They had been forced by a Justice Department decree to use cumulative voting to solve racial gerrymandering. Well, not gerrymandering. They used block majority elections. So they were allowing a small white majority to take every single seat in the elections. And cumulative voting is a form of almost proportional representation. And they had been required to use that as the remedy, but when the justice decree order expired, they wanted to continue using this system. They actually did do I believe, a citizens' assembly, something that is often used in Canada, a citizens' assembly on election reform to decide what they wanted to do now that they had been for about 7 years using a new voting system. And they took us through the process legally of actually litigating these ancient home rule rules, and figuring out what they could do in the modern day, because a lot of things have changed since the home rule clause of the state constitution was added. Like, one thing, for instance, is that local governments like villages and towns can have the county board of elections operate their elections, right? That was never conceived of in the context of having home rule over elections. So Port Chester kind of trailblazed this whole situation for us by actually doing the work of adopting a alternative voting method. And this time, without the Justice Department decree, they had to actually be compliant under New York State law. And they had to get a opinion from the state's, I believe the Secretary of State of New York's office, on how exactly it could be interpreted, the power over the mode and selection of officers. But the important takeaway is that everything was greenlit every step of the way. And this isn't especially impactful to the Green Party in this case, because there was an example where, why do I not remember the name? There was the Green Party mayor in, I'm trying to think of it. I'm not going to remember the name of the town, but there was the Green Party mayor, Jason West, I believe.
Yes. Newport.
And
Yes.
Newport.
Yeah.
New Paltz.
Newport,
Thank
New
you.
York.
And yes, and this occurred before the whole situation in Port Chester had occurred. And one of the things that happened was there was a majority that in that case wanted to implement ranked choice voting for New Paltz elections. They did not know about home rule, and no one had touched it since 1936 in regards to elections. There are plenty of examples across the entire state of local governments using home rule to supersede state law and change things with regards to all sorts of issues of local government. But no one's touched it for voting since 1936, and they wanted to, and they did not know that home rule could be used in that way. So they sent an official request to the New York State legislature asking for a law that would enable them to use ranked choice voting locally. They never got a response, and ultimately the majority changed. And I've actually reached out to the New Paltz local government saying, hey, are you still interested in trying to do this? Because you actually have the home rule power to be able to implement this yourself. And we have all of the court records, and even the clerk of Port Chester has made himself a resource available at my request to speak to pretty much anyone who wants to know about the process they went through. Sadly, New Paltz is not going to move forward with it, but that is an example where there could have been a local victory for a change in how we vote, and it was simply a lack of knowing what their power was. And it's interesting because this power is actually detailed to some extent in the New York State Local Government Handbook, which I discovered after doing the research myself existed. But the big powers afforded in New York State's home rule grant is a little different depending on each local government, but here are the big important pieces of it. Cities in New York State have ballot initiative powers, and they were extended to all cities. I don't recall the exact date, but all cities today have that power. I don't know how many people here are aware of that. I can tell you that I have talked to the leadership in multiple cities and towns and et cetera, all across New York State, and found they had no idea that they had home rule powers, let alone that there was a process, right? County governments have a process by which, by petition, voters can force a charter commission to be called. Sadly, for those of us stuck in towns like myself or villages, while the power exists, the local legislature must exercise it, right? But they do have the ability to implement alternative voting measures, from the classical ranked choice voting to proportional representation. You could have a city decide to completely change to a parliamentary system of government, and that is entirely allowed under New York State's home rule powers. There's actually, the state legislature has the power to limit home rule by passing a special law, which requires 3/4 of both houses of the state legislature. And this has only been done once, which banned the use of block majority voting to deny racial representation. And it's the only restriction that currently exists. But yeah, so I didn't have a slideshow available or ready for this presentation to discuss that. But one fantastic resource is the New York State Local Government Handbook. I just recommend everyone take a look through it if you didn't know that it existed. And it's published by New York State. But the laws that govern home rule are required by the New York State Constitution, and they are the municipal home rule law, the city law, village law, county law, and town law. Yes. So now that I've covered the local home rule powers that we have, I really should have prepared better for this. The major purpose of my organization, Make Voting Powerful, which I'm not going to pretend is a large organization by any means, has been to take this discovery of what home rule powers we have and push for a strategy of trying to reform as many local government elections as possible, so that as many voters as possible will look at their local elections and say, this is great. Why doesn't the state work this way? Right. That by the theory being, we can put pressure on Albany to reform elections by reforming our elections locally. And I think everyone's aware that in 2019, New York City would come back around again to use the home rule power over its method of elections and implement ranked choice voting. So they paved the way with that again, and there's also some important legal opinions and court rulings that came out of that. But yeah, home rule has been revived and reestablished in regards to voting method, and I have been trying to get that message out to as many people as possible. The natural question that arises from that is, what should the reform be? And that's where my relationship with Star Voting New York comes in. And this I actually have a proper presentation for. And I'm going to attempt that right now. I'm not that familiar with Zoom, sadly, but I have used it before. If I can, yes, there we are.
Perfect.
Is it going to let me full screen? No, Zoom has taken control. Well, in any case, sorry
It's
for
pretty
the,
big. No, we can see it.
yeah, yes. But star voting is a single winner voting reform that tries to use modern contemporary voting science to sort of maximize what you can get out of having a single winner reform. I'm speaking with broader terms here, but I assume a lot of people in the Green Party at least are aware of the difference between a single winner election and like a proportional representation election, right? So star voting is the sort of cutting edge of voting science, and it's where a lot of people in the voting science field land for what we should be looking at doing. So with here, the idea is that we should be able to vote our conscience without wasting our votes, and the candidate who best represents the people should win. And you're going to be familiar with a lot of this. But in our current system, anytime there are more than two candidates in a race, vote splitting can leave majority coalitions divided and conquered, allowing candidate opposed by the majority to win. I think we're all familiar with this and how vote splitting breaks up a majority coalition if they are not fully united. But this leads to a number of knock-on effects. Vote splitting causes the famous spoiler effect and strategical voting to prevent it, but you also end up with wasted votes. You end up with gatekeeping of elections, and that's something that I don't think a lot of people think about when they're talking about reform, is what are the incentives on donors and volunteers and organizations like media outlets when it comes to covering elections in a setup where you have vote splitting and you have the possibility of a majority opposed candidate being able to win because the vote was split among multiple factions, such as the Green Party and the Democratic Party and the Working Families Party. This puts a huge incentive on all external organizations to not only not support more than two options, but to actively try to hamper them. What's worse is our voting system actually mathematically increases polarization. It favors a strategy of getting the largest block of extreme, what would be the word? Extreme fanatical supporters over measuring actual support among voters broadly, right? Because it requires that you only it makes the vote a limited currency, and voters can each individually only give support to one. And that right comes down, creates two-party domination. It actually magnifies the influence of money in politics because viability becomes the game rather than actually being popular or having good policies. Right. So under our current system, voters who aren't strategic risk wasting their votes, depending on how you interpret wasting your vote. Voting methods which eliminate vote splitting: star voting, both its single winner and proportional forms. Ranked robin, which is another way of taking a ranked ballot and tabulating that to get a result in terms of winner you would want. And approval voting, which is sort of, a lot of people are at least becoming aware of approval voting, but it's just our current voting system minus throwing out ballots that select more than one. Choose one, what we currently have, does not eliminate vote splitting. It forces it for no reason whatsoever. And that's a argument that I've actually made to multiple town supervisors and gotten their response. Like, I actually agree with you on that. The only difference between approval voting and choose one that we use now is that if I go ahead and I say I like the Green Party candidate and I like the Democratic Party candidate, the vote counting rules say throw out that vote. You can't have two. You can't like two. It doesn't matter what you actually think. If you remove that rule, you get approval voting, right? And I think that illustrates how vote splitting is sort of this completely arbitrary thing. We don't need to have it. So for methods that eliminate vote splitting, the voting methods that eliminate vote splitting are those that allow voters to support as many candidates as they like, allow voters to support candidates equally, which means that you can say, I have two first choices, and counts all of the ballot data given. If voters can show that they support all the candidates on their side, then factions can coalition to prevent being divided and conquered. What do we want in a voting method? We want it to be simple, honest, expressive, accurate, and equal. So we don't want it to be too confusing for voters or for election workers. We want it to be honest so that we are not trying to win the game, but we're trying to survey voters and see what they actually think about the candidates they're being offered, right? Because you know from polling, voters feel a lot more positively about the Green Party than the voting system actually reflects. Expressive, we want a voting method that allows voters to fully express all the candidates they support, how much they support them, and in what order they support them. We want it to be accurate, obviously. And we want it to be equal, that it doesn't advantage certain candidates. And like I said, our current choose one voting system as a mathematical advantage given to candidates who can get the largest block of exclusive support over candidates who have broad appeal to all voters. If everyone likes you, but nobody loves you, you lose in the current system. It counts for nothing. Star voting is very simple. You have a 5-star ballot. You give your favorite 5 stars, your last choice 0 stars, score other candidates as desired, equal scores, such as 2 5-star candidates, equals or indicates you have no preference between them. And if you leave a candidate score blank, we assume you gave them a 0. The magic of the 5-star ballot is that it lets you show your preference order, but also your level of support. Is your second choice great, or are they a lesser evil? Right. You could imagine a scenario. I always like to pitch this when I'm talking to like local Democrats. I say, what about a voting system where you could have 2 Democrats run and they don't split the vote with each other, right? And so that's the sort of thinking is you want voters to be able to say, a Green Party voter to be able to say, hey, yeah, I might want my vote to support the Democrat, but I really don't like them. Versus you might say, oh, well, this candidate from, I don't know, for example, DSA, I have no idea, is actually pretty decent. They're not my first choice, but I actually really like them. And you could indicate that by giving them 4 out of 5. Right? Star voting is it's much simpler than a lot of other voting reforms, in that star stands for score, then automatic runoff, and it only ever takes 2 steps to count. In the scoring round, the 2 highest scoring candidates are the finalists, and in the automatic runoff, each voter's vote goes to the candidate they preferred on their ballot. So it comes down to 2 rounds of simple addition. You add up the scores and you add up the votes. Well, I should have switched to this one. I said add up the scores, add up the votes. Well, the voting system that we're often very familiar with is ranked choice voting, where votes are counted in rounds. And if a candidate has a majority of remaining votes in a round, they are, this is in my way. Majority of remaining votes in a round, they are elected. Otherwise, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated. In each round, your vote goes to the remaining candidate you ranked highest. And if your vote is unable to transfer, it is discarded. Ranked choice voting has its own pros and cons. It has a more expressive ballot than what Choose One allows. It results in more positive campaigning. It allows jurisdictions to skip the primary if desired. and it mitigates the spoiler effect in a election only 2 viable frontrunners. But for cons, voters rank candidates, but most rankings given are never counted. That's because one of the features of ranked choice voting is that you can never harm your favorite by ranking another candidate after them. But the problem is that means that people have given information on their ballots in terms of who they prefer, and it isn't counted until certain conditions are met. By selectively ignoring ballot data, it can skew election results. Those whose favorite is eliminated but whose next choice isn't counted are unfairly disadvantaged. Candidate preferred over all others can lose. Elections with 3 or more competitive candidates are the most likely to fail, and that's the situation where we want the voting method to be able to perform, is when we have more than 2 viable options. The major piece of information that convinced me, because I had been advocating for ranked choice voting since around 2012, I had actually been supporting the, I believe, 2012, yes. And then in 2014, I actually was supporting Howie Hawkins' run precisely because he supported ranked choice voting. There was a 2012 exit poll conducted in New York City that looked at voter behavior under alternative voting methods. Choose One was compared to approval voting, a 5-star voting system, and ranked choice voting. This graphic shows what the results were, and these are results from actual voters who were polled as they left the booth. And you can see Obama was at over 80%. I believe he was 89%. And you can see Romney comes in second. Jill Stein comes in third. And when you look at approval and star, what you see is that Obama's support actually increased because people who liked other candidates were able to show they did also support Obama. But one of the most incredible things is Jill Stein jumps into second place. And my first response to that was, you know what? In a New York City precinct that's overwhelmingly very progressive, that makes a lot more sense than Romney, who never had a chance in that precinct. And it's interesting that he goes from second place to last place when you switch the voting method. So 5-star and approval voting results showed support for third-party candidates that was otherwise lost. When it's compared to ranked choice voting, which was also polled, you can see the result is almost the same. Under ranked choice voting, Romney was still in second place, and because Obama won of more than 50%, there was no runoff round, and all choices beyond the top choice were ignored. And so that huge amount of support that Stein had in terms of actual support from voters saying, hey, who do you like? Not who will you vote for under the rules you expect. The difference is night and day. And this kind of demonstrates, this is the data piece for me that made me say, okay, this star voting thing, I need to learn more about it. Our ranked choice voting ballots only allow voters to rank a limited number of candidates in a normal American election because ballot sizes are limited and we use these bubble sheet ballots. So usually the number is 5. That's why star voting defaults actually to 6 levels of differentiation. Limiting the number of ranks in ranked choice voting helps prevent spoiled ballots, but increases the number of exhausted ballots in races with large fields of candidates. With star, voters can score as many or as few candidates as they want because equal scores are allowed. So that means if you have a situation, you might say, how often are we going to have a huge field of candidates? Well, first, if you lower ballot access requirements, you're going to have more qualified candidates. And that's what happened in the, I believe, I can't remember the California governor's recall election that led to Arnold Schwarzenegger becoming governor. They had over 100 candidates listed on the ballot for the race. In star voting, you would be able to score as many candidates as you had an opinion on. With the standard ranked choice voting ballot, you would have 5 ranks to give. And when it comes to polarization, this is with our voting method currently favoring polarization. It's a little bit hard to quite understand, but candidates at the center of public opinion have to compete with competitors on both sides, which makes them especially vulnerable to vote splitting. Candidates in the middle are the most likely to lose, even if they would have been supported by the most voters. It's called the center squeeze spoiler effect, and it is considered by voting scientists today to be the major pressure behind why we have a two-party system. This is a graph measuring how often candidates win under simulation based on how much voters agree with them. So candidates who are at the center of public opinion and liked by everyone actually become less likely to win than appealing to one or the other camp. And this becomes more pronounced as you add more candidates. Here we have 3 candidates, 4 candidates, 5 candidates, and that dip becomes more and more visible. If there are only 2 candidates, the most representative candidate will win, and winners will generally reflect the same distribution as the voters. But when we move to election with 3, 4, 5, or more candidates, vote splitting, strategic voting, and the spoiler effect leave us with a much more polarized set of winners. Candidates in the middle of the political spectrum are at a mathematical disadvantage. And when we say at the middle, we don't mean at the middle of where politics is today. We mean at the middle of voters' opinions, right? And I think everyone here should be very familiar with the idea that those are 2 very different things. When you compare choose one voting and ranked choice voting under these same conditions, ranked choice voting effectively prevents the most polarizing candidates, seen here by these dotted lines. You can see there's quite a drop-off in terms of who the most polarizing candidates are that were able to get elected. Ranked choice voting does bring everything towards the center a bit more. But it has the same center squeeze effect, the same appealing to too many voters too well, it causes you to lose effect. This means that winners will still be polarized into 2 artificial extremes, and the system could result in two-party domination over time. And a lot of people point to Australia's use of ranked choice voting both as an example of what it can do and also an example of its limitations, where they've maintained a two-party system for about the entirety of the 100 years that they've had ranked choice voting in their lower house. With star voting, assuming a good representative candidate exists, winners will accurately reflect the center of public opinion, even with more candidates in the race. Candidates from the polarizing extremes don't win, and candidates in the middle have a level playing field. Here it compares ranked choice voting again, 3, 4, and 5 candidates, to star voting under the same conditions. And star voting heavily tries to select for the candidate who's actually appealing broadly to the voters that exist in that election. One of the ways that we use to measure a voting method's accuracy is known as voter satisfaction efficiency, which was coined by Dr. Jameson Quinn, a PhD in statistics from Harvard. Studies like this one model realistic election scenarios and measure how often each voting method is expected to pick the most representative winner. Each method is looked at with honest voters, strategic voters, and with different voter behaviors for different factions, where, let's say, Green voters are being strategic and Democrats are voting honestly. And you get a left to right spectrum of how often the voting system is selecting a candidate who satisfies a high voter satisfaction efficiency. Not surprisingly, plurality voting, what we use now, scores abysmally low, especially if you have as soon as you introduce any sort of strategy, it gets worse and worse. If you're 100% strategic, you get the best result you can possibly get. And that's why voters are being conditioned over time to always vote strategically for the lesser evil, because mathematically they're getting the best result that system can give them, at least in the short term of a single election cycle. When you look at ranked choice voting, you can see that it actually significantly pushes up the VSE score that comes out of elections. But it also has some odd situations. One great example is that 100% strategic voting base actually ends up doing the worst under ranked choice voting. So it's very good. It encourages honesty. But then you can see approval actually edges out the middle And star voting comes in at, under almost all conditions, being one of the top of the chart methods. How are we doing? 24. Okay.
A lot of
So
the
yeah,
time.
this is a, what'd you say?
You have a lot of time.
Yes. So among single winner voting methods, this scorecard helps to look at individual criteria. Does the vote splitting / spoiler effect exist? Under choose one plurality voting, yes. Oops. Ranked choice voting, yes, but only with 3 or more viable candidates. Star voting, no. Advantages some type of candidates. I don't quite agree with the way this chart puts them. It uses different colors, but uses the same language. Advantages certain types of candidates, yes, but ranked choice voting, at least to be fair, it limits the extremes, but then also selects against the most widely liked candidate. So it's an interesting case. It does overall moderate politics, but it still favors candidates who are viable, because if there are more than 2 viable choices, you can get vote splitting, and that will train voters not to do that. That doesn't exist with star voting. Wasted votes and exhausted ballots. Under choose one, not voting for front runner is a wasted vote, whereas in ranked choice voting, exhausted ballots are, those aren't direct comparisons. Not voting for a front runner, wasted vote. Exhausted ballots are not counted in the final round under ranked choice voting, which most exhausted ballots aren't a problem, but some are. And in star voting, that doesn't occur because there's no elimination in star voting. So there's no possibility for ballots that could have been used to be set aside because of the way that the counting process happens. Local tabulation is a huge one, and it's one of the primary reasons that voting reform advocates have to keep more than one method in their arsenal, because one of the stories you never hear when talking about the attempts to use ranked choice voting in different places is that almost universally you will have the people in charge of actually conducting the elections. We're talking about the poll workers, we're talking about the boards of elections, will end up coming out opposed to ranked choice voting, because ranked choice voting requires centralized tabulation, where if each individual precinct attempts to count the votes on their own, as we do now, the result would be wrong. They actually have to all be counted at once. Star and choose one don't require that. Tabulation complexity. Choose one voting is very simple, but it's very bad. Ranked choice voting has a series of instant runoffs. And star voting only has 2 rounds. One instant runoff, if you will, and one scoring round. Here's the VSE, and also another metric, strategic voting incentives, which is how rewarded voters are to be strategic versus not strategic. So under choose one, you are 17 times more likely to get a good result by voting strategically than by trying to vote honestly. With ranked choice voting, it significantly reduces that, 2.7 to 1. But with star voting, we've found a nice balance of it being pretty statistically unimportant whether or not you're doing honest or strategic in terms of, is the voting system going to reward you in some way mechanically. Let me ignore this. Want to go down to, I don't think that I need these other examples. I could go through them, but here's this. Star voting is adaptable. And this is one of the big things facing voting reformers, is the question of what to do about primaries. So star voting, very adaptable. Do you want it to be nonpartisan? You can do it. Partisan also can do it. Primaries, with public primaries, like top 4, top 5, you could do that as well. Fully adaptable. When it comes to districting, and number of winners, you can do single winner, multi-winner, proportional representation. It can handle all of those situations. And election integrity, no new voting machines or new hardware. necessary. Star voting only requires software upgrade. It is able to be it is compatible with risk limiting auditing, which ranked choice voting has an issue with. Any central tabulated voting method does. And results under Star are extremely quick because it is only 2 rounds of addition. A lot of times voters get very upset with how long the results can take to come in, which with the advent of mail-in voting, I think that's going to be less and less of an issue as people get used to it. But even in places without mail-in voting, the delay, for some reason, that is a large concern to voters. To me, I don't quite understand that. This just compares star voting and ranked choice voting in terms of the ballot. So you can see they're very similar. Yeah. And I think this one's an important one because it's one of the famous examples of ranked choice voting producing an odd outcome. Was the 2009 Burlington mayoral election, in which you had Kiss, Montral, and Wright, where Montral was the candidate who was preferred head-to-head to both of his opponents, but he had less first-choice rankings than either, which caused him to be eliminated first. Voters' rankings, which showed the full size of his base of support, were never counted, which is a fair point to say that ranked choice voting can guarantee you that you're not going to get your worst result, but it also can pick the wrong candidate under certain circumstances. And that recently occurred in Alaska, the Begich Palin-Peltola race. I was actually explaining this to one of our Republican assemblymen, what actually happened in that race, and actually got him to go to a much softer position from opposition to ranked choice voting and all voting reform, thinking that it was a Democratic ploy, to understanding mechanically, hey, this is what actually happened. This is how it translated into the result that it did. In the case of Begich, Peltola, and Palin, one of the most interesting things is that Palin was the spoiler candidate. She could not win under any voting system, yet by entering the race, she altered the result because she split the vote with the other Republican who was actually preferred over both candidates, meaning that if he went up against Sarah Palin or he went up against the Democrat, he would have been won by the rankings that voters gave. But because he had the fewest first choice votes, he was eliminated first. And then voters got their second best option, because if voters were asked, do you want the Democrat or Palin? Voters in Alaska wanted the Democrat over Palin. They, what that's called is that the candidate who is most can't win under ranked choice vote. Right. I believe that's the entirety of this slide deck that I would want to be talking about. I would also like to let me think. No, I actually think I will consider that the end of the presentation part. And if any questions, yes. Let me actually cancel out of the well, I can actually go down to let's see, do I have a nice one I can stop on? There, where's star voting being considered? So yeah, does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have anything that they would like to say? Okay. I can see you can see Joseph there.
Thanks, Tom. Tom, you're the stat keeper?
I am
Yes.
the stat keeper.
Excellent. Putting that in the notes. Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew. This is very educational. Yeah. Thank you for all of your work. It's really, really impressive. I wrote down a couple of notes. I was writing them down and I didn't write them fast enough. So what was the home rule over elections? That was an article in the Constitution of the state. And was that, did you say
Article IX.
Article IX? Thank you.
Yes, it's the local governments clause. Yes, and it grants, like I said, control to the local governments as a reserved power over the method and mode of selection and removal of officers. And like I said, Port Chester and now New York City have both gone through the modern court, what would you call it? The arena of the courts and survived the challenge that yes, they do have home rule over their elections, and they can implement their own voting system. And it's been actually quite extensive. One of the interesting outcomes that came out of Port Chester is that they voted to have the county board of elections conduct their elections from now on so that the village no longer had to pay for it and that the county would have to do it, which is prescribed for under New York state law, but there's nothing specifying anything to do with what if they did home rule and changed their voting method. The outcome of that court case was interesting. The Board of Elections eventually conceded so that a ruling would not be made. But they had attempted to interrupt them at multiple points, claiming that the voting machines couldn't handle cumulative voting, which was untrue. And they admitted that they had been dishonest about that. And they had claimed that they were not required to conduct local elections that were not using the state standards. But the outcome of that was that they conceded, and the next election to be conducted in Port Chester will be managed by the county. So that was an incredibly positive outcome because it says that even if the county doesn't like what your local village is going to do, let's say your local village is, we're going to use party-list proportional representation in our village. That might be a bit overkill for a village, but if they were going to do that and they also wanted the county to continue to pay for and handle their elections, the county has to do that. They don't get the ability to opt out or refuse.
That's cool. And ballot initiatives. I'm in the city of Long Beach. So you were saying that cities
Yes.
have ballot initiative powers.
Yes.
I was wondering, do you mind going into any of the process that is?
Yes. Let me stop sharing my screen for a moment. I have a document that I had prepared on that. Let me see. Oh no, that's not the one I wanted to open. But it is a simple process in terms of it's just a signature gathering based on the why is my document not loading? Based on the gubernatorial results. So yeah, the process is that 10% of those who cast votes for the governor in the prior election need to sign a proposal or sign to send a proposal to the city council for referral. If the city council does not take action or votes down the petition, then 5% more signatures, so a total of 15% of signatures of those who voted in the previous governor's election can force it to go to a public referendum. So those do have to be separate signers from those who signed the initial 10% petition. Yes.
So say like you're trying to get hypothetically, the city to opt into cannabis sales, could you get 10% of signatures for those who casted, votes in the gubernatorial election last one, as a way to try to get them to get that measure passed? Or is
Right.
that just to get an initiative on the ballot? And then if the city doesn't do anything.
Right. So the first number, the 10%, you propose it to your city council. They have to take it up, they have to look at it, and they have to decide to pass it, to vote it down, or to take no action. If they vote it down or take no action, you can then collect 5% more signatures for a total of 15, and you can force it to the ballot. Now, when it comes to any question regarding the elections in a local government, that requires a referendum no matter what. So let's say even if the city council said, yes, we want to do star voting, and they passed it, it still goes to the voters because voters have to approve changes to elections.
Interesting. So if you got 10%, and then they said, yeah, we're going to do it, but it has to be voted on by the population. Are we required to get 5% more signatures after that, or?
No. If they approve it and it will just go directly to voters as though they had drafted it themselves.
It should be their responsibility. Okay.
Right. Right. So one of the most interesting outcomes of that, maybe not particularly useful to your particular chapter, but is that in New York State, cities are not defined based on population. They're just based upon whether or not they were ever legally designated a city in the past. And what that means is that tons of cities in New York State are incredibly tiny and have such small populations that the signature requirements for a ballot initiative are less than the signatures to get on the ballot for the council in that city. So an example is that I was talking to a group in the city of Oneida, and their total signatures to both propose and then send to referendum was only 1,067 signatures. Which is an oversight in the municipal home rule laws, city charter ballot initiative process, that you can have very small numbers of signatures under the right conditions. I need to make this big again. Does anyone else, or I mean, are you done? Sorry.
Oh, that's interesting. Long Beach has 3 times the amount of citizens as Oneida. I just checked. That's still not that overwhelming.
Elizabeth, do you have your hand up?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, I have a question on the ballot initiatives. I understand only 26 states allow ballot initiatives, and can you speak about why that is so, and what is the best way to try to get New York State or any other state to allow it?
So that is the reason that I joined up with Unite New York, and it was one of the primary things we did when we went to Albany. They're still going to Albany, but I've only been with them for lobbying once. Is one of their primary goals is to get ballot initiative established in the state. And the process for it is, I think, difficult, but I do think that it's doable. I suppose that requires stepping into what Unite New York's strategy is. And their strategy right now is to try to pass term limits on the governor. And the reason is that they have a fantastic resource that they pay for because they're a dues-paying membership organization. They are able to afford their own lobbying group and their own polling firm. and they have the voter, why can I not think of what it's called? The VEI. I can't. I don't know why I can't think. 45 minutes sleep. They have a poll that you can see, a polling series you can see on their website, which I encourage everyone to look at. And their reason for creating it in the first place was that they wanted to ask questions the polling companies weren't asking, for things that third-party candidates could run on, because at one point they were a third party. And one of the things they find, voter empowerment index, that's what it's called. One of the things they find is that an overwhelming number of New Yorkers want change. A large majority of New Yorkers think that we are behind on democracy, that our government doesn't work, that it needs to be reformed. When you look at all of those numbers, it ends up being all very positive. But when you ask them, do they think change is possible? The number plummets to somewhere in the 30% range. And so Unite New York's strategy is that they want to pass something simple and small, but to voters that seems large. And in that case, that's term limits on the governor, because what they're trying to do is change that number from barely any New Yorkers thinking change is possible to many New Yorkers thinking change is possible. And until that number moves, getting ballot initiative in this state is a very difficult battle, because what has to happen is that the state Senate and Assembly need a 2/3 majority, I believe, to approve a constitutional amendment to allow ballot initiative. Then they have to, there has to be new elections. There has to be a new session of both houses that then pass it again. And then it goes to voters for referendum. And that's a very difficult process for something they don't actually want. One of the legislators we spoke to, both first was confused that he believed, even though he'd been there for around 14 years, he believed that New York State already had ballot initiatives. And then when we informed him that we in fact don't, he said, "Oh, good, I don't want that." That was a interesting interaction. Although he wasn't so opposed, he was afraid of supposedly crazy proposals getting on the ballot. But the Unite New York strategy is convinced that voters that change is possible by lobbying for something that state legislators themselves would actually want and benefit from. And in this case, we used to be the forever governor state with Governor Cuomo. The legislature is enjoying the independence they've had from Hochul. And the idea of term limiting the governor is something Unite New York thinks they could get the legislature to agree to. And if the legislature goes along with that plan, then they're hoping the response from voters will be, we term limited the governor, we have power, we can change things. And then from there, it is about just having enough public momentum to demand ballot initiative. But I do think that is a difficult fight. And that's why I also, and I did talk to the strategist, I've talked to Tim Dunn, the strategist from Unite New York, a number of times. And he also thinks my strategy of trying to push for voting reform by reforming local governments and local elections to raise the visibility of voting reform as an issue is a great way to run around the state legislature on the matter and sort of build momentum without having to work with them on it. I'm not sure if that answered what you were asking, though.
Yeah, it does.
Jim Brown Stack.
It seemed like it's very difficult, but thank you.
Jim Brown.
Maybe I could get involved in Unite New York Sounds like a good organization. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, so I'm next, I guess. Oh,
Jim Brown Stack.
yeah, just, thanks for, a very informative presentation. And star voting, it sounds similar to ranked choice, but has some advantages perhaps. But I just wanted to bring up something that in the 30s and 40s, there were several places that had ranked choice voting through, I guess, the municipal action. There was New York City and Long Beach, Long Island actually had ranked choice voting and multi-member districts, which is something that was good for democracy. And basically, we were studying this when the Green Party was a part of ranked choice New York, and I did some of the research on that. And the reason that it disappeared really was during the McCarthy era. These city councils in Yonkers and New York City and Long Beach were actually becoming pretty radical and suggesting a lot of things. And I think the Labor Party was involved and some other left-wing citizens groups, and the powers that be around, time of World War II, a little afterwards, came down hard on this ranked choice voting because it was getting too rambunctious for them. and so they got rid of it, but it's coming back, and that's a good thing. So I just wanted to
the story of its repeal in New York City specifically, I didn't know about Long Beach, but the repeal of it in New York City, there's a very little information on this period, by the way. It's quite difficult to get a hold of it. But one of the big turning points in New York City's history, while they were using proportional ranked choice voting, was that they elected two open communists, one of which was an African American, and his election specifically was seen as sort of the turning point in public opinion, especially combined with McCarthyism. But it was the combination of McCarthyism and racism that led to voters who, I believe Democrats only held 52 out of the 100 seats under the system. Voters approved overwhelmingly the repeal, and purely to prevent the smallest sections of voters among them from having any say. So that's an important lesson learned, that that division like that can absolutely be the enemy of voting reform. And also that proportional representation works, and we should definitely try to spread that as much as we can. And I do want to comment on the last thing where I brought up Unite New York, to say that Unite New York has sort of taken over the mantle of being the voting reform group statewide as well. Now, they have a different perspective than I do on that, but I think that it's worth working with them over the shared perspective that we have, because I support their term limits concept, although it is although I sometimes am skeptical of certain term limits. Theirs is a consecutive term limit, which I like. They support ballot initiative. They want to reverse the increased signature requirements that are being burdened onto third parties in New York State. They want that to go back to the way it was. They have a legislator who's already sponsoring legislation to do that. And they also support ranked choice voting. With their current bill, would be ranked choice voting in a public primary and then a top two general election, which is certainly not the exact election it's set up I would design, but they're sort of the group that has replaced ranked choice New York. And yeah, just wanted to say a bit more on them. Does
John, do you
anyone
have
else
your
have
hand
any
up?
questions?
Joey's hands down.
I'm sorry. So I was curious about ballot initiatives in a towns or counties or villages, are they pretty much nuanced specifically to each municipality, or is it more general, like all counties to get through the process of ballot initiatives or X, and all towns are Y and villages are Z? I don't want you to spend too much time. I know you got 45 minutes of sleep. Just I don't know. You can go into it a
I
little
missed
more.
I missed the beginning of your question because my headphones suddenly gave out.
Oh, I was just curious about ballot initiatives in not just cities like we covered before, but also in villages, counties, and towns.
So sadly, we don't have ballot initiative extended to any local governments beyond all cities qualify. And 2 counties did a special request to be allowed to use ballot initiatives that had to be approved by the state legislature. Only one of them followed up, and that's Suffolk County. They also have a ballot initiative process, and I have been aggressively trying to reach everyone there because they have a lot of issues going on with their county legislature right now. And I'm like, this would be a perfect place for voting reform. So only the county of Suffolk and all cities in New York State have ballot initiative powers. Once you go to villages and towns, you no longer have that, and you do need to work through the local legislature. Although obviously they're members of the community and they are much more reachable and accessible at times than state legislators, and they also have different interests. Oftentimes what I've tried to focus on with local legislators is, hey, when it comes down to it, your position as local legislature, that's, not particularly that powerful. You're constantly fighting the state like we are. At the end of the day, we have a lot more in common as people governed by the state, and it's in Albany, than we do differences. So, usually you can appeal to them as though they were just any other voter. That doesn't mean they're going to understand what you're arguing for, but nonetheless. And counties are unique. They have a strange process. They don't have ballot initiative. Counties that do not have a charter yet can petition to force a charter commission. That charter commission is then still appointed by the county with no restrictions on how. But it has been used successfully in the past to reform counties dramatically. It is I'm very cautious of the process. On the one hand, you could engage the public with it. On the other hand, it is entirely allowed that the county legislature appoints themselves as the charter commission and votes no changes. Which is absurd, but that is currently the way the state legislature has handled the charter law. There is also a provision I'm looking of a legal volunteer. There is a strange provision of town law that says that any lawfully submitted local measure can be petitioned to be sent to referendum by voters. And that process, if it works the way it sounds like, and we're unclear because no one's ever used it that way, but it sounds like if you could get one member of your town legislature to propose a bill, even if it's voted down or not even taken up, that voters could petition to force that legislator's proposal to referendum. But that I can't confirm is a process that actually exists. It depends on how that law is interpreted, but it would be a very interesting case. I actually think that would be a fantastic alternative to ballot initiative, not entirely to replace it, but just as a concept, if you can get one legislator who elected and they can propose something, voters can make it go to the referendum. I think that's a great idea, honestly.
I agree. I wanted to so New York City, you mentioned a little bit about how in 2019 they got ranked choice voting. Not sure if it's exactly the elections that it encompasses, if it's just school board, but is there movement to try to make that into STAR?
as far as I'm aware, I mean, there are most of the members of Star Voting New York are in New York City. I would say that if we are working on that, that doesn't necessarily have momentum at the moment, but it always could. Right now, as far as I understand it, New York City's ranked choice voting law created a requirement that party primaries use ranked choice voting.
Okay,
So the Democratic primary and the Republican primary both will use ranked choice voting, which that's a kind of almost silly. The Republican primary in New York City is, why is it even there? But it doesn't use it in the general election. The major movement on the ground right now in New York City, from what I understand, is the top 5 public primary people who want to eliminate the partisan primary and have a top 5 primary going to a general election. They by default want to have a choose one primary and then a ranked choice voting general election among the top 5 finalists. But I wouldn't say they're necessarily committed to ranked choice voting itself. They are just committed to the idea of, hey, there should only be public primaries and no partisan primaries, which I know is a point of contention for a lot of Green Party people. And I think that's one of the strengths of star voting, is that the reason why star voting works so well is that because it is 2 rounds, it's effectively a scored primary and then automatic top 2 election. So it can be used in the general election. You don't need a primary because it already does what a primary does. But also, if you wanted to have, let's say, a top 5 public primary and then star voting, it still works fine. So we've really been trying to reach the public primary folks.
We have to
say,
sort of
hey,
wrap up soon. It's about 9 o'clock, I think.
Apologies.
So-
Apologies. Does anyone else have anything? Any questions?
Well,
I
want to thank you for your presentation. It's given us a lot to think about, and it's obvious that you really are into the, all the detail of the different groups that are operating in New York and what the developments are. We appreciate you sharing that.
Yes,
that
I
with us.
apologize for how unprofessional my presentation was.
Not at all.
Well, we've
But,
had worse.
not at all. But we thank you for coming and introducing us to me to Star Voting. I'd heard about it, never knew what it was. But thank you a lot. And for the group, I want to say petitioning starts tomorrow. I'll be sending Shelley some petitions and Tanya, so they can get started. And Tom, I think you already have some. And we'll be talking as things go on, and trying to get out there and get our numbers, which are at least 45,000, but we're aiming for at least 60,000 statewide. And thank you for voting the money to the to the state party for the petition drive. I think it's very important that we do that. So I guess that's it, unless there's anything more to say. But for the evening, but we'll be back next month. And again, a lot for coming out and giving us a program, a very complete program. We haven't had one in quite a able to make.
Yes,
Thank you, Matthew, and
Thank
thank you,
you.
for
Jim.
having me.
Good night, everyone.
Right. Meeting is adjourned. Good night.
Guess we're
Good night.
adjourning.
okay.
Good night, all.
Good
Good
night.
night to everyone.